Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So this episode I'm calling The Spiral of Israeli, Jewish, non-Jewish Zionist, and Palestinian Moral Narcissism of Victimhood. So what I'm trying to explain or highlight in this video is a sequence of events, or a sequence of events is a sequence of events, but a sequence of thinking that leads to events, that leads to actually the spiral of violence, of hatred, and so forth and so on, that we see in the Middle East, in between Israel and Palestine, and hatred and vengeance. Okay, the cycle of, the battalion cycle that I've been talking about. And I think there are a couple videos that are exemplary of thousands and thousands of hundreds of thousands of sequences of logic and of illogic that lead people to continue on stoking this spiral. So, and these two, again, I'm just picking two out that I have videos for, so forth and so on. So one was an interview with Naftali Bennett, who was the former prime minister of Israel. He's a right-wing prime minister. He was when Netanyahu was in between Netanyahu's terms. He was heading the coalition, or he was the prime minister until Netanyahu's return, and he was being interviewed about these recent events, in Gaza and in Israel. Anyway, and so he became enraged by the interviewer asking him about, I believe it was British TV, but anyway, interviewer asking about also Palestinian civilian deaths and so forth and so on. And Bennett flew into a rage and said, "We are fighting Nazis." So so this is also another interesting psychological phenomenon in Israel and so forth and so on, and among Jews more generally. Sort of misrecognition or repetition of history psychologically, rather than in reality. So, but so this idea that, or basically what Bennett was saying, is that our suffering as Jews is what matters, and the Palestinians' suffering can be dismissed. So there's a entire negation of the suffering of Palestinians, and so and obviously this has murderous consequences when you give people like that, or when they have weapons, and when they particularly have weapons of mass destruction, when they have one of the best armed militaries in the world facing a people who is very poorly armed or not armed at all. So that's one example, and then that's maybe an extreme example, but you have lots of, I think he expresses a certain segment of Israeli public opinion when he flew into that rage. So and then there's another somewhat more subtle but still, to me, very alarming example, is an interview with on Sky News, where you had in Britain, where you had Owen Jones, who is a left-wing journalist, and then you had Margaret Hodge, who is a former, or is it still a member of Parliament, who has connections in Israel, and who happens to be Jewish as well. But anyway, where you had this, the interviewer was asking, there sort of was point counterpoint sort of interview where you had supposedly two people with different views of the situation. So anyway, so the first person to talk was Margaret Hodge, and she talked about her, this terrifying experience of the terror of October the 7th, and then and she went on and she talked about the people she knew, so forth and so on. And then the interviewer turned to Owen Jones, who, while he knows Jewish people in Britain and he knows Israeli people, he doesn't have that connection. But anyway, he is there to represent another perspective. And he was talking about, he was extremely upset as well by the events of October, the attacks of Hamas and their attacks on civilians. And he was talking about some of his an Israeli friend of his in London. But then he said, look, but we have this grave danger of a Israeli genocide of the Palestinians. And as he was trying to say this, Margaret Hodge kept on interrupting him, and it's as if she could not hear what was clearly happening. She couldn't hear, and Owen Jones was saying, well, look, the head of the the defense minister of Israel called the Palestinians animals, and there was all this basically fascist rhetoric that was coming out of the Israeli government, and she couldn't hear it. She literally couldn't imagine that her, again, the sense of being vulnerable and a victim could possibly share the stage with Palestinians who are experiencing victimhood at the hands of, well, not her hands per se, but at the hands of a government that she seems to support. Or, again, she's not, you can't call her, unlike Bennett, she would be considered a quote-unquote liberal Zionist, or, probably, as she's in labor in Britain, maybe supports Labor or some other related party in Israel. So not in the coalition that's current, or at least the coalition that started the war. But anyway, so you had, and there are many, many examples of on Twitter and other places where you have people who are saying my victimhood is something that, or the victimhood of my people, or the people that I'm advocating for. So it could be someone who is either a pro-Israel, member of the European Parliament, or Ursula von der Leyen, who is the head of the basically the European Commission. So you have these very high officials in Europe, and also similarly in the United States government, who are extremely hesitant. Some, not everybody, but extremely hesitant to allow two victimhoods, or two types of victimization, or two types of suffering to share the stage, or to be compared, or to be taken together in some way or another. My approach here is to look at those things together. That's I see them as being interwoven, okay? That you can't just sit there alone and look at your own victimhood or the history of victimization of your people without looking at comparatively at other histories and so forth and so on, or how they interact, or how your victimization turns into someone else's victimization. And so, or your suffering turns into how you, or your people who you support, or your political representatives, or the people you imagine to be your heroes in some way or another on the stage of history, how they represent your position, suffering, whatever it is. So anyway, I think the concept of moral narcissism is a way to think about this. So I've talked about moral narcissism in another video, or one or two other videos on Politics 2100, and it's a topic that's very it requires a great deal of judgment and care to talk about, because it potentially is used by the right wing to condemn the use of ethical ideas and ethical motivations in politics, and say that to create a politics of cynicism and of pure self-interest, because it's saying, well, people who are motivated morality are narcissistic. That's so it's an accusation thrown at people on the left, and I think that's wrong, and I think that's not only wrong, it's just using psychology as a form of political attack. So, and I think that I believe, and I know from my own experience, that without morality, without a sense of moral purpose, we won't survive as a species. We need to have some kind of, and particularly on not just on an individual basis, but on a macro basis. In other words, so we need to have a sense of the systems of our society and how they're not functioning well, or the systems between governments, or the interaction, international relations, war and peace, so on and so on. So we need to understand how our senses of right and wrong are striving to do good, so on and so on, can mesh with and can push these systems toward sustainability, essentially, and toward justice, toward equality, and overcoming oppressions and domination of one class of people over another, but also of one nation over other nations. So pushing aside that particular misuse of the concept, there are still ways in which you can constructively look at how people take that they gain a sense of superiority and a sense of righteousness from having a certain moral position, that becomes either politically or personally ineffective, and so that's one way, and that's closer to what I'm talking about here. But here there's a very particular, the moral narcissism of victimhood is a very important idea in this conflict, I think. So basically, especially when we're dealing with peoples who have suffered a lot, who have experienced in reality, and they try to make meaning out of that in different ways, and one of the ways they do is to say, well, that sense of victimhood means I'm entitled to better, and that's a good thing, so forth and so on. But it also creates in some people a total a way to negate other people's personhood and other people's suffering, and the sense of being with Jewish people, or with the religion, the Jewish religion, and also that the idea that Jews are the chosen people, so forth and so on, that can co-determine in some individuals, and also individuals, unfortunately now with lots of power in Israel and other places, that that they negate the suffering of Palestinians, that the only people whose suffering that matters is the Jews, especially within this conflict. Okay, but you have, or the Israelis rather. So, but also poured into that in the diaspora community of Jews, that they identify with, not everybody, and so there's a whole community of people who resist this form of moral narcissism, who resist the sense of the idea of uniqueness, or entire, not only just uniqueness, but entitlement, or world obscuring sense of being the victim and the only entitled victim to justice. So you are the only entitled, and so this is something that happens in lots of conflictual fights that people have about, legally, so forth and so on. There are people who, in civil disputes, so forth and so on, that are feel like they are the wrong party and the other people have wronged them, or and sometimes reality bears them out, and sometimes it's not the case at all. It's part of but anyway, it's a position to have. Certainly it can draw people in too. So with the conflict with for me as an American and also as a Jew who doesn't partake in, or I certainly don't feel like I partake in this particular type of sense of victimhood, and or using that sense of victimhood, maybe is a better word, to obscure other people's issues and so forth and so on. So what I'm particularly troubled by is the way that politicians in Europe, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and also the United States, amplify and create this surround around the moral narcissism, or the victimhood, the sense of the world obscuring sense of victimhood and of entitlement of some of the leaders of the right-wing government of Israel, and that and they represent a constituency also in Israel who feels that way, there are, and they have some religious fundamentalists, Jewish religious fundamentalists, who have a mythology from the Bible that talks about their entitlement to the entire land, and that the Palestinians have no claim on the land because of what the Bible says, and or what it was like 2,000 years ago there. So anyway, this moral narcissism is something that needs to be overcome, okay, literally, and it needs to be overcome by political change, among other things. But the political change, I think, comes from psychological change and vice versa. It's not. It's a dialectic, you could say, between those two things, that on the individual level and also on the group level, and then on the societal level overall. So anyway, but getting back to this sort of, it's maddening to me that there are so many politicians that are that reinforce this sense of specialness of Jewish suffering that is. I think that it's good that people are aware of the Holocaust, aware of the persecution of Jews in Christian societies in Europe and in the United States and so forth and so on. I think it's good that people know about those things, and that they really that it's taught in, in American history and so forth and so on, or in European history, the history of the Holocaust. It's very important to know about. Those are very, amazingly awful events that occurred in the 20th century, and also before and later, and in Russia, the pogroms and so forth and so on. So there's a lot to talk about there, but the specialness that is walled around it is a very, it's a dangerous thing for Jews, among other things, and also for other people who, in this case, very specifically the Palestinians, who also have suffering that is a direct consequence of the European decision to support settler colonialism in Jewish settler colonialism in Levant, in the former British colonies there, and then that decision has terrible consequences for the Palestinians, or has had, and it still has. So this whole idea of the specialness is extreme of Jewish suffering. If you take away the specialness, the suffering and the history of suffering is still there, and it's not going to be erased, okay? Or we have to make sure it isn't erased. But the notion that it entitles Jews to victimize Palestinians, or surrounding nations, Arab nations surrounding Israel. Now, they did attack. There was a period in the early evolution of Israel where, there was, you could say that there was clearly maybe justification for the militant response by Jews against the attack, definitely. And so if once they had settled there, once they were there, but this obscures the whole project of how this occurred and why, so Europeans essentially have washed their hands of their own Holocaust, or their roles in the Holocaust. And they haven't washed them entirely, but I'm saying is that was one way that they could, let's say, depressurize themselves from the history of Christian anti-Semitism in Europe. So anyway, if we can develop democracies around the world, and this is still a work in progress, where people's, where many ethnic groups can come together and value each other, and don't form hierarchies of ethnic, rightness and so forth and so on, or superiority, inferiority. If we create the sense of understanding the differences and understanding histories that are negative and so forth and so on, and that where there was victimhood, where there is still victimhood, but we don't get so wrapped up in ourselves that we can't see our way to cooperation, to mutual recognition, to understanding differences and similarities between experiences, so forth and so on. Anyway, so this sounds like, to people who are into militant Zionism, or for that matter, militant Palestinian liberation, without any regard for Jewish people's safety in Israel. This seems like, this is all very pie in the sky, so forth and so on, but it's the only way for that kind of solution to emerge where people have dignity and they share prosperity, they work together, so forth and so on, and they become a multi-ethnic region with no hierarchy, with a group with no single group that is dominating the other group, and also is the stand-in for European and American domination for the region. So, and therefore the alien, so to speak, or anyway. So, but that is a process that is a long process, but it requires a different concept than what we have currently there, a different approach, a different, you could say, constitution. So anyway, so I think one of the barriers to this is this overwhelming sense. So just to briefly address what I use, the word Palestinians, also moral narcissism, you have this also reflected back. So you have a echo chamber where you have people who are deny that there was any victimization of Israelis by Hamas. There was that they think the righteous stance is to just say that's nothing. Those people, their suffering is nothing, so forth and so on. And it's like, that's also moral narcissism. Okay, they're saying my suffering is what matters. Okay, their suffering, and I can understand how intolerable, because so many very powerful actors are coming in and echoing is the exceptionality of Israeli/Jewish, but mostly Israeli suffering is, and how their history matters so much, and everything else is secondary. And so I can understand why Palestinian intellectuals or people on the ground, so forth and so on, would want to just say, I don't want to deal with that. We're the special ones. They're not the special ones. And so, and to take away their intolerable, you could say, grandiosity. So, I mean, this is where, the two-faced quality of narcissism is that there's a grandiose face and a vulnerable face. And this moral narcissism is part of the more the vulnerable face, where you say my vulnerability, my victimhood makes me better, okay, or gives me more entitlement to hit you back or to oppress you, so forth and so on. And so, and that's why it's so hard, among other things, to independently verify from either Palestinian or Israeli government sources, certainly, when atrocities happen or so on. So everybody is claiming for themselves only the best. So, or the best being, in this case, being the victims, okay, and the other side being the aggressors. And this is also something that we see in contemporary neo-fascism in the United States. The right wing, the GOP base, most of it, the Trumpist base, is about the sense of being victimized by this sort of woke conspiracy, and it's kind of laughable. In this case, so for Palestinians, it's actually real that the Israelis are oppressing them, okay? But in the United States, you have this a similar psychology, but the reality is different. In other words, they are actually closer. They have a greater hold on the state power in the United States and also some other aspects of power than their numbers would suggest. In other words, they're about a third or a quarter, even a third of the U.S. population, but they have overwhelming representation in the judiciary and in many state legislatures and in the electoral college and the Senate, so forth and so on. So, but they still think of themselves as being victimized and constantly needing to find a way to claim this high ground, or this sense of victimhood that is very dangerous, because they are actually quite powerful. And also, it's very dangerous in Israel. It's very dangerous in Palestine, or among Palestinians, with the sense of the unreality, or the sense of being entirely at the bottom of the pit and looking upward. And and look, people in Gaza are really suffering. So there's a reality to it. And so the idea that they are, they feel though they're entitled to take it away from other people, and take away their lives, so forth and so on. That gets you into a cycle of terrorism and so forth and so on, and a cycle of violence, cycle of oppression, a cycle of military exchanges, and then the more powerful party trying to do genocide on the less powerful people. So anyway, I hope this concept is somewhat helpful, and I'll talk more about this in different episodes using a slightly different lens. Just wanted to put this out there. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Please like the video if you got anything out of it. Please subscribe to Politics 2100, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks.